Good morning. Welcome. Wait for a couple people to jump on. So this morning we're continuing with our Lenten devotional, and so we're working through this book, and hopefully you've purchased it, you've checked it out. It's called Everybody Needs Some Cave Time by George Acevedo, and it's a great book. We're doing our series, sermon series for Lent through this. We're doing a daily devotional Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. bright and early here on Facebook, and then it will be on YouTube a little bit later on. And so we've been plugging through this, and so last week Pastor Craig shared our first week talking about the caves in our lives. And so the book goes through Old Testament and New Testament characters, and the various caves they experience, either physical caves where they actually go to a cave, or emotional, spiritual caves of oppression, or temptation, or anger, those different things. And so we are glad you're here with us. This first week, Pastor Craig shared story of Samson and the cave of anger. And so if you haven't read that story, go in Judges. You can read it. It's pretty unbelievable. A person who's been given gifts and powers, able to do things that no one can do through the power of God, and yet struggled with anger his whole life, and how at various times anger got the best of him. And so today we're talking about anger as we go through this daily devotional. And so the question that I have for us today is this for us to reflect on. How does anger lead to other negative emotions? How does anger in our lives lead to other negative emotions? And what is it like to be a spectator to anger and arguing or an outburst? What is it like to be sort of in the room when that happens? And there's this great quote. The end of last year, my wife and I did Alpha Marriage course, which is fantastic. I would recommend it. We did it at the church. We had a couple couples join us, and we kind of went through this Alpha Marriage course, and it was amazing. I would encourage you to check it out. I would love for us to do it again. And one of the quotes when they were talking about sort of in relationships with your spouse was this. An emotion is never buried dead. It's always buried alive. An emotion is never buried dead. It's always buried alive. And anger is one of those emotions that we bury quite a bit in our world. There's lots of things that make us angry. There's lots of things that frustrate us. And when we don't deal with those things, we just sort of bury it down. It leads to coming out in other ways, in other places and spaces. Maybe the wrong time. You're angry at something that happened in the morning, and a little bit later on in the day, someone does something, and all the built up anger, all the things you've buried throughout the day become just thrown at this one person. It's an overreaction. And maybe you've experienced this. If you have had children, you know there's lots of little things that can kind of build up, and if you can't regulate as a parent, it comes out. And so I know for us as parents, we're always trying to be aware that because one child did something, it's not the other child's fault, right? We can kind of attach those things. We can have these outbursts. And same with our children. How do they process anger? How do they process their frustration? How do they make sure that they're handling it and dealing with it in a healthy way? And so Paul, the Apostle Paul, usually when Paul writes a letter to churches, he's been aware of an issue, a problem, something that's happening that is just really harming the church. And so Paul is really great about giving encouragement. He'll write a letter to a person in the church, or the church as a whole, or he'll write to a group of churches. They'll kind of pass the letter around, and he'll address certain things, and he'll give lots of encouragement. Hey, you're doing a great job here. I've heard about your faithfulness here. You've done wonderful things in this area. But I've also heard that this blank, you've been fighting, or there's tension, or you've gone back to old ways, that kind of thing. And so Paul writes this letter to the church, to the Galatian church, and And in this letter, there's some pretty powerful stuff for us kind of dealing with things even in our world today. And he frames it this way, and I think this is really powerful. So Galatians chapter 5, he talks about the nature of Christian freedom. That because of our faith, because of who we are, because of who we follow, because of who Jesus is and what he's done, there's freedom, there's victory, there's things that we can tap into, there's things that already belong to us as followers of Christ, and one of those is freedom. And Paul is reminding people that if they forget these things, they fall back into oppression, bondage. They let other things kind of control their life. But he says we have claim to freedom. So he's talking about Christian freedom. And one of the obstacles that he gives is he calls it the work of the flesh. And you'll hear Paul use this language in other places. But the work of the flesh is sort of our human nature, the natural things within us, and how those things, if left alone, if allowed to build up and be buried and not addressed and not dealt with in healthy ways, those things become oppression. They become the things that keep us in bondage. They become the things that kind of hold us captive. So he talks about the works of the flesh. And so the verses I want to actually read here are 5:19 through 21. And the interesting thing is, again, Paul is really great about, he gives encouragement, he kind of addresses issues, and then he gives some helpful things to do. So Paul talks about freedom that we have as Christians. Now he's going to talk about the things, the stuff in our lives, like anger, that really kind of hold us captive. And then right after these verses, and you'll hear about this tomorrow, right after these verses, he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, which we hear a lot about. We don't always hear about these verses I'm about to read, but we hear a lot about the fruit of the Spirit and what it means for us to have that freedom through our faith. But Paul says this about the work of the flesh. He says, now the works of flesh are obvious. They're obvious to everyone, right? You know when you're in a room and there's stuff going on with other people, right? When there's arguments, when there's tension, all that kind of stuff. He says, the works of the flesh are obvious. Fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissension, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. Okay, he lists a whole bunch of stuff that really nobody really wanted to talk about then, right? And nobody really wants to talk about now. We don't have conversations where you say, hey, tell me about your impurity, right? That's a weird conversation starter. But he lists all these things, and he says this. He says, I am warning you, as I've warned you before, those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. He's saying those things, if left alone, if left unaddressed, will take over your life, will hold you captive, will prevent you from the good things in life, the things God has for you. Those things will prevent you from having freedom that Christ has already given, that we have this Christian freedom, that God has conquered all these things already, but yet our humanness, when left unchecked, like anger, can take over. Now, one of the cool things about this, about these verses here is, again, that Paul is, he's letting us know before he even lists these things, that we have freedom through Jesus from these things, that there's nothing that holds us back, right? That we can claim victory. But he says these things, if left unchecked, if you just let them run wild, if you let them control your life, you will always feel captive to these things. And he says, right after this, he lists these things. He gives us encouragement. He gives us hope in the fruit of the Spirit. He said, these are the things that we can lean into. And again, we'll hear about that tomorrow. And so this season of Lent is about us sort of looking deeper within ourselves than maybe we're really comfortable with. And this week, especially, we're talking about anger, is one of those emotions that I think people bury deep down inside. We get angry all the time. We have things that bother us. We have things that push our buttons. And sometimes in our society, it's polite to just bury our emotions. Sometimes in relationships, it's easier for us just to avoid anger. And then other times in our world, it's best for anger to come out in unhealthy ways. And so we have this world that we live in that doesn't help us, that doesn't give us the pathway to deal with anger and these kind of emotions. And so Paul is giving us the fruit of the Spirit. He's leaving these things very clear, very out in the open, and he's saying there's freedom in these things if we choose. If we choose to dig deep, to deal with things, to give them over to God, to trust in what God is going to do. And so today, I want you to be thinking about this question or this thought. I finished seminary at United Theological Seminary. It was fantastic. And the president, Kent Millard, said this, and it sort of stuck with me. He asked this question. He says, am I willing to surrender myself to the will of God before I know what God's will for me is? Am I willing to surrender myself to the will of God before I know what God's will for me is? And I think sometimes these things in our life, this humanness, can fill our time. It's easier for us to trust in our anger, to trust in our tensions, to trust in sort of the chaos of the world than to trust in God's will for me, because there's fear, there's anxiety about what that is. And so today, I want you to be thinking about that. Am I willing to trust if God today, in this Lenten season, if God made it very clear what his will for my life is, would it make a difference? Or am I willing to trust God's will for me before I know what it is? A lot of times in life, anger comes from frustration of not knowing what to do. And in this season of Lent, we purposely spend time wrestling with that question. What's this next season look like for us? What's this next thing that God has for me? What's this next part of my faith that I'm being called to tackle? To build the fruit of the Spirit in a certain place where maybe it's been lacking? What are the things I need to deal with that are within me, the things of the flesh, the human nature that's preventing me from being who God created me to be? And so my encouragement for you today is to know that God has a great plan for you. And even if you don't know what it is, even if there's fear and anxiety around that next step, trusting that God is good, that God has good things in store for you, and that through that path, there's freedom. Paul knows this. He writes to the church in the letter of Galatians so that they know this, and we know this today through the work of Jesus, through the work of the early church, through the work of Christians down through the ages, those we know and see even in our world today, that there is freedom, that there is hope, and there is a goodness in God's will for us. And so today, have a great day. I thank you for joining us this morning. We're going to celebrate today. Today is our birthday day, so both of my children have their birthday today, so we're going to eat lots of good food and celebrate. But have a great day. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you all tomorrow. See you.